Good evening, good afternoon, possibly even good morning, depending where you're joining us from. Welcome to the first Lacan in Scotland of the academic year 24-25. Slightly earlier time, um, unless you're joining us on YouTube, in which case it's whatever time you want it to be. And if you are joining us on YouTube, please give us a like in the button below. And also tonight's talk, as we do with some of our talks, we have those of you who are familiar with Lacan in Scotland, we mix up more clinical and more theoretical talks, and tonight's talk very much spans both those aspects, but there is a strong clinical dimension. So part of the talk will only be on the live session, and we won't include that clinical element or the case study element on YouTube. So if you are watching us on YouTube, you're going to miss a little bit of tonight's talk, which is a really good incentive to join us live. So next month, make sure you're here. But for this month, it's a real pleasure to have Evi Verbeke here with us. Evi is a visiting professor at the University of Ghent in Belgium. She's also a clinical practitioner, and she also works at Dividedness, which is a center for assisted living for people who are experiencing problems or suffering in life. So multiple aspects to Evi's career, all of which follow a Lacanian direction. Evi is going to talk to us tonight, particularly in relation to her work with Dividedness, but drawing on her very impressive academic insights into Lacan as well, weaving that theoretical and lived experience through. And I think what's really interesting about Evi's presentation tonight is it takes Lacanian theory and asks a really important question of Lacanian theory, which is, what can it do for us in the real world? Many of us engage with Lacan's theory simply as theory, and it becomes quite abstract. There is that obvious and also very real use of Lacanian theory in the clinic, but what Evi's work does is take it beyond the clinic and out into the world. And I think this raises really important statements and questions about what Lacan could give us. Evi, myself, and the Lacan Scotland team were at a conference last week in Ghent. And the title of the conference was Lacan Today. And I think there's something in that conference title that really speaks, or really comes through strongly in Evi's presentation, that it is that question of what is the value of Lacan and his thinking for us today. So without further ado, Evi, thank you for coming to Lacan in Scotland.
Okay, thank you, Calum, for the nice introduction. Okay, indeed, I'm gonna talk a bit about things I was talking about last week at the conference in Ghent. Because the title of the conference was Lacan Today, as Calum said, and it made me think, like, what is it today? What do we mean when we say Lacan today, and what do we mean with it in clinical practice? Because you have to know, I work in Belgium, and in Belgium we have a very specific context. Being we have a department of psychoanalysis within clinical psychology, which is very specific. We also train psychotherapists in Lacanian psychoanalysis. And we have different schools of Lacanian psychoanalysis, which made it possible that there are much Lacanians working in the clinical fields, in private cabinets, of course, but also, for example, in psychiatry, in centers for juvenile delinquents, in prisons, in street work and stuff. It's not that there's Lacanian on in every psychiatric institution. It's not that we're like welcome everywhere, but it is indeed, and I think it's different than that. It's not the same in every country, but in Belgium we're really there in the fields. I also said it last week. It was Lacan said that Freud should have said when he went to America, we're bringing them the plague, yet they don't know. And I guess in Belgium we are a little bit of the plague. We tend to like swarm out at places without being too contagious. Also, I have seen. But that indeed was the question for me. Like, what does it make this wide range of psychoanalysis today? What are we still talking about when we are talking about psychoanalysis in all of these contexts. And indeed, at the end of the reading, I'm going to present a case, but it will only be online here. It will not be on YouTube. But first, let's get back in time, maybe, to Freud, because how did psychoanalysis start? Psychoanalysis, indeed, did not really start from a theoretical engagement, which it became eventually, of course. But psychoanalysis started because Freud met patients for whom most people did not really understand what was going on. It's in his confrontation with hysteria that he invented psychoanalysis, let his patients speak. He introduced a radical new technique and a new theory to listen and to engage with hysteria and obsessional neurosis. But Freud, and that's interesting, for me it's interesting, he never restricted or he never said psychoanalysis is the same as this specific technique. As he noticed in some articles, he says, this is how it works for me. But it's not because this is how it works for me that this should be the case for like everyone. Maybe that others could work in a completely different style, yet with the same theoretical assumptions. Or he stated, for example, in one article, we can say a lot of things about technique at the beginning of treatment, at the end of treatment, but actually what happens in the middle kind of depends on the person, the patient, on the style. And moreover, although Freud only wrote in his cabinet, he seemed enthusiastic about the application of psychoanalysis in other fields. For example, in 1925, August Acorn wrote a book, Wayward Youth, it's called, about his work with juvenile delinquents in an institution orientated by psychoanalysis. And Freud was enthusiastic about it. He wrote also the foreword of the book. Acorn writes about the organization of the institution and gives different cases that are actually very unorthodox, both for psychoanalysis and for the regular working with juvenile delinquents. For example, instead of a strict regime of punishments with a boy who steals a lot, Acorn gives this specific boy who always steals money, gives him responsibility for the money for cigarettes for the entire group of adolescents. After a while, of course, the boy steals the money, as was predicted, and Acorn, instead of like being an authoritarian father who says he cannot do it, Acorn asks the boy to help him clean his library, and they have this conversation, and Acorn asks the boy a bit parenthetically, how's actually going with that cigarette money? The boy didn't know that Acorn knew he stole it. The boy lies, says everything is fine, but then very unexpectedly, Acorn, all of a sudden, conversations asks him how much money exactly did you take? The boy was surprised, confessed, and Acorn gave him money from his own wallet, saying he should use it to pay for the debt and he should like pay him back whenever he deemed fit. Acorn did not do this out of love or some caritas attitudes. It was actually a clinical decision, he says. He writes about it, it's to make space for transference and a possibility for the boy to speak about the stealing, not as a sign of bad behavior, but actually as a symptom in the analytical sense of the words. And a very classical analytic approach would only halt this possibility of speech, about talking about what was actually at stake, or it would make the analysts a clown for young people like that. But it's psychoanalysis indeed that orientates him through his work, and that's why Freud was so enthusiastic about it. Yet, I don't think we should overestimate Freud's enthusiasm, because he was hopeful that in the future psychoanalysis would be used for many people, also for people with psychosis, or he was also very fond of the idea of free clinics for people, and that the technique would be modified. Yet, he stated, it is very probable too that the large-scale application of our therapy will compel us to alloy the pure gold of analysis freely with the copper of direct suggestion. So it seems for Freud that his technique remains like the pure gold, the golden standard, we could say. And it's actually Lacan, I think, who takes this up again and asks himself, like, okay, what is this gold? What makes this gold shine? Why gold? And are deviations always like the copper of suggestion? Doesn't say it that way, but I think that's one of the things that is at stake, definitely at the beginning of his teachings. which brings me to the question, what is psychoanalysis? And Lacan will not focus himself on rigid techniques, which he noticed that most of his colleagues are doing. In his text, Variations on Standard Treatments, Lacan states that there is an inherent impossibility in the question, what is an analyst? But it's not because it's an impossible question that we should not think about it. And for Lacan, it's always like the trick. When we come up to an impossibility, that's not the moment that we try to transform it into something that's possible, but then we try to think about the structure of this impossibility. So I think that's always a bit at stake with Lacan. And that's his critique to the IPA. He says they're not thinking about this impossibility. They're like filling the gap by saying, okay, being an analyst is about formalization, strict ideas about right techniques, strict rules, and who should be named an analyst and who shouldn't be not. But for Lacan, the setting, these formalizations are not the most important thing. He says that it's because of a lack of theoretical rigor that analysts have to fall back on settings and on being a mirror for each other regarding what to do. Like, oh, they're doing that, so that's like a good trick to do. Or I'm not going to talk about this technique I used because I see the others are not doing it or are frowning upon it. So without really thinking, like, what is at stake here? And he says we cannot simply speak thus about a standard cure that would be better. Once you do that, you have it's based on a kind of an idea of a sort of divine technique, making speaking about standard treatments always kind of a normative enterprise. So he says the formalization of psychoanalysis should not be practical, as being a set of rules of what can be done or not done, but a theoretical formalization. And I will get back to this specific point. And later, Lacan will talk about the difference between applied psychoanalysis and pure psychoanalysis in his Foundation Act. He talks about that, saying that applied psychoanalysis is about psychoanalysis also having therapeutic applications. But Lacan in his text does not seem to imply that pure psychoanalysis was kind of the gold standard and applied psychoanalysis is impure or the copper. He does not make a normative difference, nor one based on technique. He does not state, for example, that pure psychoanalysis is about coming to your analyst 6 times a week for a minimum of, I don't know how many years. If any, he made the difference to try and think about what it takes to become an analyst yourself. And that is not based on a set of rules. He was very critical of how becoming an analyst, he says in, I think it's in Television, he says, becoming an analyst normally, which he's critical of, is more about those cunning in their institutional relations than in their analytical practices. And it's that like what he tries to grasp. In his later teachings, he will eventually step away from all formalities in naming someone an analyst and instead will work out the idea of the pass. I will not go into detail on the pass, but I do think it's a way to try and reflect like what is analysis about, what is becoming an analyst about, but like the Freudian sense of nachträglich, the English translation, deferred action, I guess. Looking back only, then you can tell something about what actually did happen there. So Lacan did not return to the difference between applied and pure psychoanalysis in the end of his teachings. And if we look at the situation today, which brings us back today, it's Jacques-Alain Miller who states that psychoanalysis, this is no longer identified with pure psychoanalysis, and at least Lacanian psychoanalysis. And I will quote Miller. He says, when we still speak of pure psychoanalysis and applied psychoanalysis, we understand that the results of the first are invested in the second. Indeed, like, for example, the past, we use it to think about how do we do psychoanalysis. And he says that it's true, and it's first of all the case of the practitioner himself, in as much as he is a result of his own analysis, which was neither brief nor programmed nor free. But we cannot neglect the fact that there is a return effect, Miller says. Applied psychoanalysis, the kind we practice, has an incidence on pure psychoanalysis. It's this what's kind of the interesting transformation, I guess, that's in the last decades. But was always present in Lacan, I think. Lacan always saw the return effect of applied psychoanalysis on his teachings and his thinkings. He never degraded this to impure. For example, Seminar 1, for the people who have read that, there's a very interesting case study about that Rosine Lefort presents. It's about a little boy who is institutionalized. He can be very aggressive. He hardly speaks. He only cries out all the time, wolf, wolf. It's a case that is discussed at length. And Lacan uses it not only to think with Lefort and the rest, how do you engage with such a case, but also to explore his own ideas on the superego and on transference. Or he had a very great interest in the work of Maud Manoni, one of his students, who worked as one of the first analysts ever with children with intellectual disabilities and who set up her own institution. And a lot of people have stated the work of Manoni had definitely had an influence on Lacan's theoretical thinking. And on the other hand, for example, it was noticeable that Lacanian theory had proven from the very start to be important for institutional psychotherapy, which is kind of a movement that started in France that think how institutions can welcome people who encounter psychosis. But nowadays, in the Lacanian fields, the so-called applied psychoanalysis is everywhere. Lacanian psychoanalysis has given a great impetus to various fields, although it was always the case, as I just said, in Lacan. I think there has been a remarkable shift in the last centuries. 20 or 30 years ago, it seemed, if you look at the conferences or the text of the conferences, I wasn't there yet, to engage in the discussions. But if you look back at the cases that were presented there, and analysts also say it was the question, like, for example, people were presented from institutions. Question like, is this really psychoanalysis? Was often there without anyone defining what real psychoanalysis then what was about at the same time, of course. Yet now it's noticeable that in a lot of conferences, definitely from the NLS, there are many cases of patients in institutions. For example, cases of someone who is in a crisis after the passage à l'acte, who tried to commit suicide, who cannot talk about it, or of an autistic child constantly yelling in the living room, or a prisoner who meets an analyst in prison. And it was once stated in a conference on applied psychoanalysis. There, somebody said, the mythical figure of the psychoanalyst who limits his practice to the four walls of the cabinets to convince of his devotion to the private cause of his analyst has disappeared. It's a bit a bold statement, but yet some things in it, I think, because what is noticeable that also for people who work in private cabinets, also see a change of, there's a more wide variety on cases in the clinical cabinets, there's no golden standard on technique. And so Miller states eventually that the return effect of applied psychoanalysis on pure psychoanalysis will only enlarge. He asks himself even, is it even relevant to still keep talking about that difference? Remarkably, I noticed that this is still an important difference between Lacanian clinicians and clinicians from other analytical schools. A couple of months ago, I was at the conference talking about my work. And there, a man said, like, okay, I work from psychoanalysis, but I do not really understand what you are talking about. He was not Lacanian, because he said, everything you guys do is so flexible, while for us, setting is all. He said, inside or outside institutions, we don't care. For us, setting is all, and the rest has to follow from that. While I think in Lacan, the logic of the case comes first, and then setting follows. This is still seems to be a difference with other schools. But the question still remains, and that's what actually I want to come to, and is maybe even at the spot, once we marginalize the difference between pure and applied psychoanalysis, is what is psychoanalysis? What makes up for psychoanalysis? What are we talking about when we say this is psychoanalytical cure? What is at stake, and what is the difference with psychotherapy? Because I do think there's still a large difference between psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. And if I made so many references to work in institutions, it's not only because I work there, but it's also because I think we can hear something from what's happening there. And it brings us to, I think, what is then eventually the theoretical formalization, or one of the theoretical formalizations of what is psychoanalysis, being analytical discourse. I think Amanda has a slide because I'm gonna refer often to the discourse theory, and maybe it's easy when we can see little diagrams. Voila, nice. So, what makes psychoanalysis in an institution? What does it tell us about psychoanalysis? It is not really, if you hear people talking about psychoanalysis in an institution, it's never really about just implementing a psychoanalyst in a team. It's not. And then it starts from the idea like, okay, you are trained in psychoanalysis. Here is your own bureau, and you are one of the disciplines between the many others. And then people can come to you and speak, although this can be very fruitful that there's somebody there taking up that function in an institution. There's a trap in thinking that institutions are psychoanalytical once you put an analyst there. Zenonis says, if you start from that idea, then the discourse and ethics of psychoanalysis are too much identified with application, sort of application of an individual therapy, usually a neurosis. For example, this was made clear for me a couple of years ago when somebody said that she was applying for a job at a ward, and she said, like, okay, what is the culture of the wards? And the head nurse said, well, normally we work from CBT, but the psychologist is in sick leave for 6 months. So this 6 months, the culture of the ward is psychoanalysis because our psychologist is psychoanalytical. But that's like, I think that's like the wrong idea, thinking you put a psychoanalyst there and then there's psychoanalysis. It's also not like working with a team of solely all people trained in psychoanalysis, or where everybody is talking very good Lacanese or interpreting each other, then psychoanalysis becomes this kind of ideal. It seems much more that it's about a specific discourse, about the discourse of the analyst that orientates the clinic. It comes up in a lot of testimonies of authors talking about their work in institutions. Psychoanalysis, they often state in the institution, is about an orientation that implicates the entire institution. It's about how psychoanalysis can guide, orientate, and think about how we care, give assistance, give asylum, and it can be done in such a way that it gives place to the clinic of the subject, of the divided subject. This is an analytical discourse. It's not as there's a psychoanalyst in team, and there's the real work is done, but it's about how to put something in place of the discourse of the analyst. And it's not like choosing, like we have an institution that's merely discourse of the analyst. Discourse are never like either nor. They can change, but it's about, can there be an opening for the discourse of the analyst through the entire institution? And I think, like I said, this is the formalization, seminar 17, of what is psychoanalysis about. It's no model nor technique. It does not depend on setting, but on the discourse, on the installation, one could say, of the symbolic coordinates by someone who is an analyst. And that's why, for example, if you say, what is psychoanalysis about in institutions, there is no model. You cannot say, like, this is the model, do this, and then there you are, you have your fantastic analytical institution. It would be the dream of university discourse, of course, clear-cut knowledge that we can transmit it to other places. There's a lot of difference in the way analytical institutions operate, yet some things are apparent, some things keep coming back. And for one, I think it is that if we look at the upside of the discourse of the analysts, it's opening a space, or the possibility of a space, where the divided subjectivity of the patients can be heard. Something of it, or a half-truth, as Lacan would say, about a subjective truth can be there. Maybe it sounds still abstract, but I think Christian Demoulin, a Belgian psychoanalyst, says, an encounter with an analyst is never reduced to mere meeting a specialist in mental health care. It's about someone addressing the subjective truth and the real that is at stake, not by giving knowledge, but by putting questions around it. And for example, in institutions, you will meet mostly a lot of people with psychosis. And you could say, okay, but what is it then that the upside of the discourse of the analyst when somebody is like in a psychotic crisis? It's not about you have to open the unconscious or other cliches, such as you should shut down your ego to let the desire of the patient speak. But does not mean that the psychotic person cannot be addressed as someone who is also divided between language and drive. It's a difference between, for example, I had a case of in the ward I used to work, of a young boy. I think he was 24 years old or something. He often wanders the streets. There's automutilation. He's suicidal. There are a lot of shoplifting. And the classic answer, which I guess is the answer from university discourse, is to give like knowledge. And for him, it was people saying, "You are an autist. That is your problem. You have to do testing. There's something wrong with you. You have to do a test. And then that test is you're an autist and you should learn to accept it." This boy finds this awful. He does not want to have to do anything with the diagnosis of autism. He thinks it's a disaster. It's not for him. But then, and it's prior to his internment with us, he had to follow a course to learn to accept his autism. And referring back on it while he's with us, he says, "There I admitted, yes, I am an autist." And he said, "My life fell into pieces." And after that, there was like many passage à l'acte, and he had to come to us. And that's the question: if you're confronted with something like that, how to hear something, how to like not slip into the discourse of the university and saying you're an autist, now how to not slip in the discourse of the master by stating you have to do this or that, and not to slip in the discourse of the hysteric and say we don't know either. In this case, I think the discourse of the analyst was not about saying like, and then sitting silent and waiting, but like engaging, talking, but asking, for example, inviting him to speak, but not about the diagnosis. I marginalized the diagnosis. That was one of my interventions. And it was because of that, I guess, that another story comes up in which the guy states, "It started when all my siblings went to university, and I will never be able to do that because I have a low IQ." And he says, "Since they're at university, I sit there alone at home. My parents ask me to talk to them, but I cannot. I can only sit there and stare into space." And there's this other story that comes up. And if there's a space that gives a possibility to be addressed as such, a subject can use the institution, I guess, to come up to definitely in psychosis, to come to a new kind of bricolage, you could say, to come to a singular invention. I guess that's the S1 in the discourse of the analyst. Lacan is very interesting, I think, at this point in seminar 17. He says it's not about merely a new master signifier. He says it's une autre style du signifiant maître, another style of the master signifier. I think it's in line with the ideas he later conceptualized as the Saint-Homme, for example, or for Joyce, being a writer was really a Saint-Homme or another style of master signifier, which indeed is, again, the question, I said before, applied psychoanalysis. Lacan talked about therapeutic effects. But still, I don't think the institution or applied psychoanalysis should have therapeutic effects as its goal. It's in the same warning for the furor sanandi that Freud and Lacan warned us for is there. Therapeutic effects are always a byproduct. But it does not mean that psychoanalysis is without effects. It has often many effects, but it knows that there will always be arrests in the symptom, which is not, for us, is not merely in the sphere of dysfunction. So I think when Lacan states applied psychoanalysis is about therapeutic effects, I don't think he means curing, and it's most often used in psychology, but about making way for listening to what is destructive for the subject, and what may seem symptomatic and weird for us, but is sometimes actually a very symptomatic solution for a specific person. For example, a little case of a woman living at the ward where I work now. It's a woman who's always busy doing everything, like she's like, and then she comes for example in my desk 5 minutes saying how she's, then she's away 5 minutes talking to somebody else, going to the shop for people. She's always on the move, always doing things. And sometimes colleagues say we cannot talk to her, we don't actually really know what is happening here. We can talk for like 5 minutes, and there's this, but what actually is her symptom? She used to be very psychotic, but what is it now? But then I noticed that at a moment we were I was drinking coffee with her somewhere outside of our building, and she wanted to get up after 5 minutes, and I said, "But okay, I will drink my tea and then we'll go." But it was at that moment she said, "Did you hear the guy say? There's a mad woman here." He's saying I'm a mad woman. Was not the case, but it was very significant at the moment something fell silent, a hallucination occurred. Hallucination, as Lacan would say, when something of the void of subjectivity is opened and there's nothing there's no signifier there, then there's a hallucination. And then it was afterwards, on our team, we kind of noticed maybe this constantly being on the move is like a work for the subject, trying to avoid this specific question, trying to avoid the hallucination, and being on the move and going to shops for people and coming in 5 minutes there and then 5 minutes there is actually maybe already kind of symptom. And it's something that the institution should make possible and definitely not limit, for example. Because the underside of discourse of the analysts, the S2, that's no arrow to the S1. That's, I think, is very interesting. It's always what a subject will come up with, what is symptomatic, we could say the other style of the master signifier. It will always be a surprise for both the analyst and the patient. It's always something unforeseen, and only it's because we have the theory of psychoanalysis that it's possible that we listen to someone as a subject that has divided between language and drive and is not to be captured, for example, in a diagnosis like autism, that it's possible to let open a little space of uncertainty because that's not easy. But eventually, what someone makes up has nothing to do with that knowledge anymore. That's why, for example, we will never say to people, "Oh, maybe you should become a writer. That will be very good for you because it worked for Joyce." We will never say something like that. And then the question is, of course, how to make this possible, how to be on that place, that position of non-knowledge, that obscure analytical position in analytical discourse, because that's the hardest place, I think. It's often referred to in a lot of text as making place for the lack. Manoni, for example, talks about the broken institution. Alexander Stevens says about perforating the institutions. You will always hear something about that in testimonies. I think Sinoni puts it very good. He says, at the place of object A, the discourse of the analyst, it's a place of a kind of leaving open an enigma, an X. And in institutions, it's often by, for example, not giving therapeutic objectives, as mostly the case. Normally in psychotherapy, in institutions, people come in and it's said like, "Okay, what is your aim? Why are you here? What do you want to change? What should we do? This is the program. We can help you with this or that." But I think in institutions that try to orientate themselves through psychoanalysis, there's an absence in the question, what does the other want from me? It's about tolerating this kind of zone of insecurity and enigma, which does not mean that it's about silence or passivity. For example, a lot of institutions have a lot of ateliers, there's a lot of going on, there are a lot of people working there, there's a lot of talk, then it's not about just sitting silent. But in the heart of the project, there resides this X, this question. So the subject could use the institution in a very own singular way. It's something I think sometimes I also hear this when the place I live is most people who live there have had interments like very much and have mostly 20, 30 years in and out of psychiatry. And a lot of patients, apart from each other, say, "You guys do not expect anything, and yet I have never had so much support. I have never experienced this kind of thing before." And I have often wondered myself, if they talk about that, is that about remaining something open so they can be put to work with themselves, but not without like letting them go and say, "Yeah, do your own thing," but being there in such a way so that that something of that question, like, who am I with my symptoms and how can I manage with this, can be opened without filling it in. And perforating the institution is, I guess, only possible when the institution is not blinded by its own ideals. As we know, groups can very easily become entrapped by their own ideals, be blinded by everything that doesn't coincide with it. That's mass psychology of Freud. For example, we have to cure people. People have to follow our therapeutic program is a kind of dangerous ideal that is very prominent right now. It's not, I think, that institutions that take psychoanalysis and orientation are without ideals. That's impossible. Saying we are the institution without ideals is eventually also an ideal and maybe a very dangerous one, because the lack is not outside the institution and it's all the fault of the others and here it's all good. The lack and the problem is also in the institution. That's psychoanalytical ethics, I guess. It's not the object, it's not the other that's really the bad guy. The lack, the unwanted, it's right there in every subject and every project, but it's more about the question, about the idea, how to question these ideals, how to empty them a little bit. For example, I think about this other man who has come to live with us not so long ago. And when he comes to live with us, he does not even come to the first time we want to introduce him. We want him to meet the building. He sends his friends. So we're like, okay, then we're going to show his friend around and not him. He comes in the evening when almost nobody is there. He comes to for the first time to his room. We cannot talk to him. He's always away. When we want to even introduce ourselves, he gets away. For our team, it's like, but why is this guy here? But then eventually we hear all other patients talking about, oh, that guy, oh, he's so nice. And he mended my clothes. Oh, he gave me a bicycle. Oh, I love to talk with this guy. And it was, for us, it was really weird. Like we never talk. He does not come to us, but eventually he's using the space. He's using the space to talk to others. He's also decorating everything. And we do not still know what our place is in transference. But the fact that we had a very unexpected place in transference, it did help us to question our own ideals. We noticed that we often thought like you have to talk a lot to people, we have to be there for people. That was maybe an ideal that had slipped into our thinking without noticing it, and that we should, for example, let this go, that we should not be blinded by such kind of an idea. So psychoanalysis institutions, I guess that's what I want to come to, exemplify something of what is at stake in analytical discourse. Ansermet says the proper experience of the institutional psychoanalysis are the consequences of the unconscious. And if psychoanalysis has to do something in institutions, it's not like only putting a psychoanalyst there, which often can be very good, but it's also for like thinking about these consequences of the unconscious in the entire institution, but also, for example, in everyday life. There's, for example, a very interesting documentary on a Belgian institution called Le Courtier. Maybe some will know about it, as Ciel Ouvert, it's called. And there you see, for example, how in supervision, it's thought about, there's a discussion about a young little boy who always puts too much cacao in his chocolate milk. And that's kind of discussion, like, okay, there's this unregulating jouissance going on for this little boy, and how are we going to react? It's not like, okay, from now on, everybody who has to, every child can have like 2 spoons of chocolate milk. That's not the idea, but it's the idea that in this singular case, what is happening, and what is this boy, what is an inability for this boy, and how can we listen to it? It's very interesting to see how analytical discourse and the idea of the unconscious is present in everyday life. And yet, like I said, psychoanalysis can never be a model. On the technical level, we see resemblances between places that work from psychoanalysis, for example. And in general, there are not many rules. There is much focus on clinical case making. There's also, like I said, different approach and in different settings. The moment it becomes a model, it becomes a strict setting, and then I guess it slips away from analytical discourse. And that's also why it changes over time. A lot of institutions have to change over time, depending on who works there, who comes there. Eventually, analytical discourse and the orientation from analytical discourse, it's also a semblant. It's also like it's not a knowledge we have and can put there. And so I think the examples I've given also hints to what Lacan talks about when he gives that difference between psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. I have here talked about it a bit, the difference with university discourse, which I think psychotherapy essentially is about. And in television, he also says it's about a different structure, where psychotherapy, I would say psychology, speculates, he says, on sens, on meaning. Psychoanalysis is much more about rejection of meaning, about the hors sens, beyond sense, beyond meaning. It's not about aiming at the complete subject, the autist, for example, but at the split subjects. Not about making sense of the position of the institution, but about reinventing its function every time again, for every subject passing through. And for Lacan, he says that's why psychoanalysis resembles comedy. He says it's about knowing that there's a non-rapport, that there is something that is not functioning and that will never function. Yet, it's around this non-rapport. It's not saying because we know it's not functioning, like, okay, back off, we gotta do anything anymore. But it's around this that creativity is possible, which happens once the institution is not bound up in its own rules, ideals, or knowledge. And I think, could it be, that's kind of my question, that's precisely applied psychoanalysis that has given some, that because of this has given some of its goals to psychoanalysis as a theory, and maybe also changed pure psychoanalysis. For example, if you read about the past, people who testify about their own analysis, you notice a very big difference in approach, in technical approach, and that there's no such thing as a standard. There's a very broad flexibility in technique, which and I sometimes wonder, is it because of applied psychoanalysis that you also hear this coming back again to pure psychoanalysis? Does applied psychoanalysis learns us maybe what is actually at stake? I think if we're not thinking about it through that, then it's very easy to like slip away again in university discourse, which eventually always can happen, of course, definitely when you're confronted with things you are very close as an analyst, or very hard for you. That's why you have to go into analysis. But it can happen easily that like psychoanalysis becomes like a knowledge machine. For example, you could just say like, okay, I work from psychoanalysis. It's not my idea. I'm not at all implicated. It's Lacan, Freud, what the guarantees, the S ones, of what I'm doing. And I use it to ask my patients to speak about their desire through free association. And I use equivox as an intervention. This is actually psychoanalysis as a kind of ideal. And I think then it's no longer comedy, but then it's just like bad slapstick that it has become. But what remains striking is that a lot of institutions that orientate themselves with psychoanalysis, and I always say they orientate themselves with psychoanalysis. I would not say that they are in psychoanalytical discourse, because there's kind of impossibility in that. But who orientate themselves with psychoanalysis try to open a bit the possibility of analytical discourse. They often work, not always, but they often work with patients who are no longer welcome in regular mental health care. A lot of psychoanalytical institutions were not installed because of you want to do psychoanalysis or the specific diagnosis. We find this very interesting, but out of a necessity, sheer necessity, because of a group of people are no longer welcome at other places. When I talked about Acorn in the 20s of the former century, for example, in the beginning of this lecture, he said, why did I start working with psychoanalysis? Well, there remained 12 children that no group could tolerate because of their behavior. They had what to do with them, start a new group and find another way. Alexander Stevens, about Le Courtier, which I talked about, he started this institution with the most difficult children who were no longer welcome in other groups. In Ghent, we have a meeting house for patients with psychosis and drug abuse. It also started because these were no longer welcome in the hospital, and two analysts decided on, okay, let's make a place and see what happens. Also, I think sometimes it happens in the private practice. In private cabinets, a lot of people testify that they receive patients for whom others sometimes say like, we don't know anymore what to do with them, cannot work with them, send them to a psychoanalyst. It's not Of course, we also see other patients, of course, but it's kind of something that's, you hear this kind of thing. And definitely today, in regular mental health care, I don't know if it's in other countries also a big problem, but we do encounter a lot of exclusion, where patients are no longer welcome in psychiatry or in therapy, and they are framed with terms such as they're non-treatable or non-motivated or treatment resistant. I think what you see there is something of the inherent limits of lack that will always be there in caregiving is individualized. It's not the fault of the system, it's the patient. The patient is treatment resistant, and that kind of logic. Yet from psychoanalysis, we could think that resistance is not from the patients, but precisely from mental health care itself. Something of symptoms in patients that touch upon their limits, that defy something of their knowledge, which is striking because the contemporary buzzword that you often hear is inclusion. It's not exclusion, it's inclusion. Mental health care is all about inclusion right now. We have to include everybody, we have to have projects for inclusion. But I think inclusion and exclusion, they seem to be two sides of the same medal. De Allo writes about that. He says the concept of inclusion carries an impasse in itself. Every project of inclusion, he says, yeah, we have this big project on inclusion and makes sure that these kind of people are welcome from now on. But if it's a project that is precise, organized with a protocol, it will always have exclusion. For example, every ward that is created around that idea, we do it for an inclusion of a very specific group of people, eventually will resolve around exclusion. It's always heard when you try to, if you have complex case and you go to ward and ask, can he or she be there? People do not say, okay, we will see about our inclusion, but they always say, no, we have exclusion criteria. He lives too far, he is too difficult, there's too much aggression, there's substance, whatever. There's always this kind of exclusion. We cannot think about inclusion without taking into account a certain exclusion. The moment you define a set, you define also what is outside of the set. And psychoanalysis is, of course, not a project of inclusion. We do not say, like, okay, if you're not welcome in mental health care, come to us. It's not a program, it's not a savior phantasm. But I do think it often hears the limits of the master discourse. It often hears what falls outside of it, what is the wastes of the master discourse and of the master signifiers. That's why Lacan also talks about l'envers, the other side. Who is excluded from care? Those who escape the morals of treatment, those who make evident that there's something hors sens, something beyond meaning, something that we cannot capture with our common knowledge, and who touch upon the limits of that knowledge. And psychoanalysis, from its condition and discourse, listens to these limits, to the hors sens, to the waste of the master discourse. I'm not sure, but I think maybe we could, I still have to reflect a bit more about it, but I think maybe we can understand it from seminar 20. Doesn't exclusion maybe hint at the fact that mental health care has a very phallic logic, that it's a domain of potency? With our knowledge, the idea is we can know madness and we can cure it. We have solutions for you. But this potency masks that once you say we have solutions for all, that it only exists by the grace, by the grace of its exception. You can only express a set by introducing the element that doesn't belong to the set. Like for all, it's always about for all except for one. And the phallic logic is reframing what falls outside the set as treatment resistance. And is it maybe because psychoanalysis also hears something about what Lacan says, the female logic, the not all, what falls outside the set, and makes a set inconsistent? The set will never be complete. Some, but not all, are subjected to the phallic logic. It's something that Alexander Stevens hints to. He says that although in a sense, he says it's completely impossible, of course, it's nonetheless necessary to think an institution not merely from male logic, but also from the female logic. Because it's not about because it's about singularity, about the non-norm, about the not all, about not filling the lack, but giving it another value. So not about being the not all, that's not logical, but about hearing the inconsistency of the set without feeling the need to expel it, or to be inclusive about it. Looking at the time. So psychoanalysis and that gap of its knowledge and the way and what people then eventually do themselves is precisely that, I guess, that opens the possibility to not anxiously shy away from the beyond meaning that is met in the clinic, but encountering it without understanding it completely. So psychoanalysis, I would dare to say, is not only interesting or nice, but is also necessary in relation to psychology that starts from the potency to all. That's also why psychoanalysis is not a discourse in its own. It's in connection with the social world. It's not something like that we can think about without thinking about the other discourses. It's also almost 9 o'clock here in Belgium, 8 o'clock with you guys. So maybe I will come to the case, so that it's a bit a large case that will not be on YouTube. So to conclude, so that we have a moment to discuss, I think analysts and psychoanalysis itself, psychoanalysis is always brought to its limits by clinical practice. It's how psychoanalysis in itself came to its existence, for its confrontation with hysteria. Because psychoanalysis is not merely the logic of the phallus, because it takes very seriously what we cannot fully comprehend, formalizing the limits of knowledge and mastery, that which shows the truth. It is a science that puts itself into question in every new case, as Freud also stated. Christoph Meyer puts it actually very good, I think. He says, psychoanalysis goes further when it's able to welcome and learn from those whose speech was heretofore on its margins, unwelcomed by the analyst or even seen as untreatable. And I think maybe is that also something that is at stake, something why psychoanalysis has to be like rethought, reinvented again and again, and be thought about in practice and in theory, because maybe the psychoanalysis is always there where he is not accepted to be, as transference is sometimes defined. And it is that space that can make psychoanalysis change, never becoming a model, a technique, or a purity. There exists no ideal for the analytic act, no academic framework, no privileged clinic setting. There exists only the analyst trying to listen to a subject, not as an individual, but as a split subject. Okay, voila, that's what I wanted to talk with you about. But I guess we have still some time for discussion, Calum. So maybe it would be nice if there are some questions or ideas or comments.
Sorry, thanks, Evi. I couldn't unmute myself there. Amanda had silenced me. Thank you very much, Evi. It was a fantastic and fantastically rich talk. For those of you who are new to Lacan in Scotland, our format is fairly straightforward. We have the presentation, then we have questions and answers, and discussion. And what I'll do, as usual, is I'll kick off with the questions, but if you have questions you want to ask, please just raise your yellow hand, and we will bring you in to ask questions. But to not leave empty space and waste the precious time that we have with Evi, I'll start off with some questions. I see a hand up already, but I have a question I do want to ask, so I'm going to take that privilege and ask the question. You speak quite a lot in your talk, Evi, and give a really fantastic example of transference. Mm-hmm. There are those who argue that transference can only happen in the clinic, that clinical structures, thinking in terms specifically in terms of Lacanian psychoanalysis, that clinical structures are something that only pertain to the clinic, and therefore transference is something, because of the containment of language within the clinic, I guess, is something that is specific to the clinic. And when we use the word transference in other contexts, we're not really talking about transference, we're talking about something else. I just wonder how you respond to that, because your example of transference seems such a good example of transference, and it is something that's not occurring within the clinical setting.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer to it. Yeah, I know there is discussion around that specific topic, isn't there? Like some say, yeah, it is everywhere and it's always there, but it's like you fall into if you're not handling it or cannot interpret it, you fall into the trap, or you completely like just talk about from your own counter transference. But indeed, there's also that kind of idea, because it only happens in the space of the clinic and language. I'm afraid I do not have a very fancy or good answer to it. I don't know, but I do think it is indeed, it is a concept. I'm thinking, or is it maybe, but I don't know if that's what you're hinting about, the difference about our conceptualization of the transference, is it right?
I guess that's...
And the therapeutic relationship, what it's called in psychology, which of course is also...
I guess that's what's sitting underneath my question is, what specifically do you mean by transference? Because we use, in psychoanalytic discourse, psychoanalytic discussions, we use the term transference, but I guess I'm not always entirely convinced that we mean the same thing when we say transference.
Yeah, indeed. It also is, I guess its meaning changed also in what Lacan, because Lacan took away the idea of its mere repetition within the analytic situation. It's I think in seminar 11 he called it the reenactment of the unconscious real. It was that, with like what's happening there between people. And I think the very specific thing about the clinical space, if you think about transference, is like what he later called not about interpreting it, but about handling, maneuvering in it. So like, for example, not being there on the place that is expected, which we also know from the very classical cases, like when a patient expects you to like, please tell me who I am, tell me. At that point, you refrain something, you do not give in, and it can be very clearly like such cases, but it can all be very, very subtle and I think it's one of the hardest clinically, it's one of the hardest concepts. Theoretically, actually, I also think it's one of the hardest because there's a fundamental impossibility also when reflecting on your cases to like say, oh, that's what transference is about. Because I think the statement of Lacan, transference and countertransference are actually one and the same. That's really true. It's not that it does not exist. Of course it exists. And that's why supervision is so important. And analysis is also important, but not like in the idea you go to analysis to like know what your part is in it. So if there's something in transference and you can say, oh, it's not me, it's you, because I know I'm like not split anymore. It's not about that. It's about being able to like to be in the position of the shit, to be able to maintain this. What would be like, no, now my answer, it's more nuanced, I guess. I'm stating it now, but
yeah, no, that's really helpful and really interesting. Evi, I wanted to ask you some questions about the discourse of the analyst. Are you up for a discussion on the four discourses?
Yeah.
Amanda, I wonder if we could put the slide up again, maybe underneath us, just so we have something to refer to. So my question is very simple, Eva. I just wondered, you talk quite a lot about it, but I'm kind of guessing that quite a lot of the audience won't be so familiar with the four discourses, but also the discourse of the analyst tends to get a lot less attention than the other discourses. We seem, I think, as Lacanian theorists, particularly, quite comfortable with the discourse of the master. It seems, we use it a lot. We understand what it means. We can make it say different things and do different things. And the discourse of the university is very straightforward. And you made reference to the discourse of the university yourself, and it's really clear, I think, what that means in that context. Similarly, the discourse of the hysteric we talk about quite a lot, and we can look at its clinical function, its political function, social function. But the discourse of the analyst seems much more particular and slightly daunting, I think. It's much more difficult to grasp what Lacan's trying to get at with that, or where the applicability of that fourth discourse is. And I guess that kind of goes to my first question, really. does the discourse, in your understanding of it, does the discourse of the analyst, is it specific to the analytic context? The other three discourses, Lacan himself opens them up for use beyond the clinic.
Yeah.
But are we limited or contained to the clinic, or the kind of therapeutic endeavor that you're talking about? And I guess there's two questions in there. Are we contained in the clinic, which kind of echoes my first question about transference, or are we contained in something slightly wider than the clinic, but still contained to that therapeutic relationship of therapeutic discourse?
It's a very interesting question, because I have often asked it myself too. Like, first of all, I think it's for me it's a bit funny that you say like for us the other discourses we use it a lot, but discourse, yeah. But I think for me it's different. But I guess it's because I was trained at Ghent as a psychologist with people like Paul Verhagen. I don't know if you know him, who but they taught us psychoanalysis through the idea these are people forming themselves as psychologists. So that's I think for me it starts in another place, but maybe that's now beside the point. But the idea is discourse of the analyst specific to that situation. And if you read Seminar 17, it's also not very clear what Lacan's position is on this, because sometimes he says like discourse of the analyst was invented by Freud. It's an invention of Freud because of the discourse of the hysteric. So you would say, okay, that it's only in the analytical situation. But indeed, then he states again and again, these are about structures. We cannot like give content to it. And it's a question I indeed asked myself. For example, if you think about teaching at university, it's too easy to say this is always discourse of the university. Mostly it slips into the discourse of the university, of course, but it can also slip into the discourse of the master and the hysteric. But I don't know, is it possible to open, not like universities to be the discourse of the analyst, which would not function, I guess, at all, but to open a little space for that. For example, if I say to my students, like, okay, you do not have an exam, you write a paper. You choose just to make it just has to be about psychoanalysis, but it's not discourse of the analyst, because indeed, yeah, you have to give them grades and stuff, but it's opening a little space of subjectivity so that they can produce something of their own. Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't dare to say that that's like discourse of the analysts, but theoretically, we should say, yeah, the discourse of the analyst can be in all places, because it's not about content, it's about structure. But there are spaces that make it more easy to open something of the discourse of the analyst. But of course, it's almost, or maybe, I don't know, but I'm just thinking out loud right now. Couldn't it be possible that these are like places that are more favorable to have some discourses there, like the analytical place, or like university, or like how authority used to function? But that not mean that in these places at some points cannot slip into another discourse. Like, maybe is it the same thing like when we are talking about, I sometimes have it a bit hard to find Lacanians sometimes talking about the mother and father functions. I know Lacan used these words, but Lacan also said it's not about real daddies and mommies. It's about a function, yet indeed, in our society, for example, the mother function is often occupied by the mother because it's like this favorable context for it, but it's not like it can also slip into something else. And I don't know, it's just now that I'm thinking about it, that maybe it's something like that.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I've often thought myself the discourse of the analyst, it ought to work very well in a pedagogical setting. So the idea of the discourse, the university being synonymous with the discourse of the university, I think is probably often the case, but it shouldn't be the case. That there is a space for teaching, which is not the transmission of knowledge, which is the discourse of the university, but a space for teaching, which is about opening up exploration, opening things up for students. And in that sense, to me, it seems very applicable. But I guess I'm asking from a clinical perspective, does that seem a misuse of Lacan? But you seem to suggest that it doesn't, which is reassuring. Staying on the discourse of the analyst, you make reference to seminar 17, obviously, where Lacan explains this. The top left-hand space, the space where object PTA is in the discourse of the analyst, is often parsed as agent. So we have this is how Lacan presents it. I think Paul Verhaeghe, who you referenced there, very clearly presents it in this way. The agent, and underneath the agent you have truth. So in the discourse of the analyst, you have A in the position of agent. But in seminar 17, Lacan also refers to that space as the symptom. And he also refers to it elsewhere in seminar 17 as the dominant.
The dominant, yeah.
And I wonder if you could say a little bit how we understand object PTA. Because if you think of object PTA in the place of the agent, that's quite a difficult... it's difficult to grasp what that would mean. Object PTA in the position of agent. If we're talking about discourse, if you think of the master discourse, it seems fairly straightforward. You put the master in the position of agency, the master is addressing the other. But when you put object PTA in the position of agent, it's a little bit, to me anyway, more difficult to grasp exactly what that might mean, or how we should understand that, how we should interpret that. It seems more clear if we start to think of object PTA as the symptom, and the dominant, again, I'm not very sure how we understand that. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's the most difficult indeed from all. Once you try to formulate that place, it like the most nasty thing, because like how you always I always get stuck also in how to formulate that. But I think that idea, like I said, leaving a space open there, it's maybe easier to know what it is by. That's often what Lacan does by saying what it's not. It's not about like taking up knowledge, not about taking up like this is what we do, or about like I don't know what to do. I'm also in crisis. What should happen? But like more like something that's, I don't know, an enigma. There's something I do not know that I open a little bit, and then that's why you should talk. That's why I want to hear something of you. And that's, I think, what I learned from applied psychoanalysis, and maybe I would not have learned when I would simply work in a private cabinet, is that place we should be weary to not like also formalize that as, for example, you have to be silent. For example, I heard a psychologist say me, I'm very much for the ethics of silence, so I don't say a lot. But I don't think that's a dogma thing. We're reducing ethics to that. It's much more silencing when you're confronted with your own morals that you want to put there, or with your, or like when I actually did first with Angela, like, no, it's not true. It's not that what I'm saying. Which I think was more discourse of the hysteric at that moment than the discourse of the analysts. But there are other people who theoreticize it as you can only take up that it's a position of waste that you are confronted with in your own analysis. And it's with that rests of your own symptom. That's how you're going to have to make your own style to, and that's the only way it's possible to be like that. Place in different kind of transferences, that it's like, okay, I can be this position or in that position, and it does not touch me anymore as such. If you think literally about the object A as it's often talked upon, then it does not make any sense anymore that it's there in the discourse. Then it's kind of weird to be in that place. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's actually really helpful. Thank you. It's gone 8:30 here in the UK, but I am going to ask one more question because because I want to.
Go ahead.
You, just in your answer there, you used the word dogma, which I think is
I
used the word dogma,
yeah,
which kind of hovering over quite a lot of your talk, and particularly the first half of your talk, when you're talking about conceptions or definitions of psychoanalysis and the impossibility in some ways of defining psychoanalysis, and that kind of, as I understand it, what you're presenting is very much a pushback against or a resistance to dogma, an argument against dogma. And you also in your talk, you're talking a lot about psychosis as well.
Yeah.
And there seems to be a kind of curious conjunction there. And we think of psychosis, the very simplistic understanding of psychosis, it's a kind of that's attachment to certainty and the need for certainty, which is also what dogma is. So there seems to be a kind of curious overlap between particular conceptions of psychoanalysis and psychosis, or one of the things psychoanalysis might be trying to grapple with and cure or work with. And my question for you is kind of maybe slightly tangential to that point. That's kind of the framing, but psychosis has a kind of curious history in psychoanalysis. It's written about a lot. I mean, Lacan writes about a lot. It begins his work writing about psychosis. He comes back to it again and again. But for many psychoanalysts or many people writing on psychosis gets slightly marginalized. And, there is the argument, you can't cure psychosis, you can't really treat psychosis, and you shouldn't, you have to work differently, let's say, with psychotics or with psychosis in the clinic. But there's very much an anecdotal observation. It seems to me psychosis is something that is spoken about more and more in recent years. And I just wondered, as a final question, kind of very open question, is that something that you experience? Are we living in a time of psychosis? Is psychosis more prevalent? And I don't mean that in the statistical sense of, are there more people who are psychotic, but is psychosis somehow, and this I think where it relates to my framing about the idea of dogma, there seems to be much more leaning towards or leaning on or feeling the necessity of the comfort of dogma in our society at the moment. And by our society, I mean globally, but I also specifically mean within psychoanalysis, that people feel the need to know the answers rather than the discomfort of not knowing the answers. And I just wondered if in your work, as I said in your introduction, you work in a university, but you also work in clinical practice, and you also work in the real world. And I wonder, is this something that you encounter?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, which I also have thought about, because first I would say you cannot cure psychosis, but you cannot cure neurosis as well, of course. That's a thing. But indeed, if you see the history of psychosis and psychoanalysis, although Lacan talked a lot about it, I guess in the 80s and 90s, it was still much more about neurosis. But in the last 10 years, and definitely in the school of Miller, it's all psychosis. Some say neurosis has seem to have disappeared. It's and some are critical and say, okay, it's not only about ordinary psychosis, but there's also something like extraordinary neurosis that we should not forget, which is often a critique given. At this day, I hear it a lot in the schools, like people saying, okay, it seems like the only neurotics are analysts talking about their cure, and all the rest is psychosis. It's not that extreme, of course, but it does open the question, like, should we see this merely as it's because we have now another framework that now psychosis is in some schools, not everywhere, but in some Lacanian schools, psychosis is where it used to be hysteria. And I know psychosis is a paradigm, and then you get this kind of dogma around it indeed, and kind of like we do not think about it anymore, and can be like easier, like, okay, psychosis, what is destructive for this case and what is his symptom, and kind of it's slippery slope that we can fall into that. But is it only that, or is it indeed that? And it's an idea that a lot of people have. Society is changing, and because of the change in society, we see that, like, the Oedipus, the name of the father, is not longer the reference anymore for most people, and people are conjuring up their own new kind of reference to manage the world, their own new kind of symptom. And maybe that's why it's more logical now to have like the psychosis as the paradigm. But even if that's so, even if that would be the case, which I'm not sure if that's the case, but even if it would be the case, it still does not like give us free tickets to merely like think, okay, from now on, let's forget neurosis and just like take the easy roads, and that becomes dogma. Yeah, it is tricky, and I often hear it in case presentations and this trickiness. Yeah. I think all the times when something is too easy or too much, like, and then I'm like, oh, danger zone. let's think about this. Also in psychoanalysis, indeed, it's not because we're psychoanalysts that we cannot be caught up in ideals. And yeah.
Yeah, no, very good point. Thank you, Evie. I think, did you want to come in with one last question or comment?
Yes, I just wanted to say, I think so sometimes when I think about psychosis, it's almost like this breaking open, and I sometimes think about the amount of trauma that people go through that is not being pushed aside. I almost wonder sometimes whether the neurotic person didn't push aside their traumas and try to live in the world in a neurotic way, whereas the psychotic is actually the person who's breaking open in just in an extremely terrible way. And I agree with you about dogma. It would be so easy to get caught up in the dogma. So very interesting. I don't want to take up any more of our time.
Thank you. Yeah, for comments.
Thanks, Dee. And thanks, Evie, for an absolutely fantastic talk. I can see some of the comments in the chat saying what an amazing talk this was. And
thanks.
I fully echo that. It's been really brilliant to hear you. And thank you so much for coming on Lacan Scotland. Real pleasure to have you here. I think we've all learned a lot. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the invite.
Thank you. We will be back next month as usual. As you'll have noticed, we started an hour earlier today than we usually do, so we will be continuing that, I think, for the rest of this year. Seems a more convenient time, particularly for people in Europe. It was getting a little bit late for people who are east of us. So I hope this new time works well for everyone. We will look to people's feedback, and we can always move things again if it's proved less helpful. We have quite an exciting, I'd say we have a very exciting lineup of speakers for this year. We have Stim van Hoel, Dries Doelster. So Lacan Scotland is turning it a little bit into Lacan Ghent, but that's a good thing, not a bad thing. We will also have Cindy Zia from New Zealand, Kevin Murphy from Dublin, and Derek Hook from Pittsburgh. So Lacan Scotland remaining very global. We will get a firm schedule of speakers up on the website as soon as we can, so you can see exactly when all those people are coming to talk to us. But it looks like another very rich year ahead. So please do come back next month and join us. If you're watching on YouTube, look out for new videos. But if you can, join us on the last Thursday of the month, because it's much better if we can all be here together and part of the conversation. So hopefully see you next month.